Welcome back to Strategic Fault Line. Tonight, we begin with a crisis that is no longer just about Iran,
status green,
Israel, or the United States. It is becoming a test of the entire security structure that has held the Middle East together for decades, and if it continues to escalate, the consequences could reach far beyond the battlefield. This is about oil, shipping lanes, military bases, Gulf security, the global economy, and whether the United States can still protect the regional order it helped build. At the center of it all is one narrow waterway, the Strait of Hormuz. A major share of the world's oil moves through this passage. For countries like China, India, Japan, and South Korea, Hormuz is not just a shipping route. It is an energy lifeline. If Iran disrupts that flow, even without fully closing the strait, the shock could move quickly through oil prices, shipping insurance, inflation, supply chains, financial markets, and eventually the daily lives of ordinary people around the world. That is why this crisis matters, not because it is another dramatic headline from the Middle East, but because the Middle East remains one of the few places where one military mistake can become a global economic problem. According to the scenario described in the original material, the United States and Israel opened this phase of the conflict by targeting the top of Iran's power structure. The logic behind that kind of strike is simple: hit the leadership, break the chain of command, create confusion, and force the enemy into paralysis. But Iran is not an easy system to paralyze. For decades, Iran has lived under sanctions, threats, covert attacks, proxy warfare, and constant pressure. It has built a military structure designed to survive disruption. Its missile forces, drone units, regional allies, and local commanders are not entirely dependent on one central command room in Tehran. So the key question is not whether a leadership strike can hurt Iran. Of course it can. The real question is whether it weakens Iran or gives Tehran a powerful symbol of revenge. That is where the religious dimension becomes extremely important. Iran is a Shia power, and in Shia political culture, martyrdom carries enormous emotional and historical weight. If Iran frames the death of its leader as a sacred sacrifice, then the conflict stops being only a military confrontation. It becomes a matter of honor, vengeance, faith, and regime survival. That makes diplomacy much harder. A normal crisis can be negotiated. A war built around martyrdom is much more difficult to contain. Washington and Tel Aviv may believe they are restoring deterrence, but Tehran may interpret the same event as proof that the war has become existential. And once Iran believes its survival is on the line, it will not limit itself to one battlefield. That brings us to the Gulf. For decades, countries like the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia have lived under a very favorable arrangement. They sell energy, bring in dollars, invest globally, build modern cities, import labor, import food, and rely heavily on the American security umbrella. That system has created some of the wealthiest and most advanced-looking cities in the world. Dubai is the clearest example. It has built its brand on safety, luxury, global finance, tourism, aviation, and stability. But that model has one serious weakness. It depends on confidence. People invest in Dubai because they believe it is safe. Airlines operate there because they believe the airspace is stable. Wealthy foreigners move there because they believe war will not reach them. Banks, corporations, tourists, and real estate investors all rely on the same assumption. If that assumption breaks, the model begins to crack. Iran does not need to conquer Dubai, Doha, Manama, or Riyadh. It only needs to make the region feel unsafe enough for money, people, and confidence to start moving elsewhere. That is why Gulf infrastructure is so vulnerable. Airports can be disrupted, ports can be threatened, oil terminals can be targeted, gas facilities can be hit, desalination plants can become strategic pressure points. And once international investors start to believe the Gulf is no longer protected, the economic damage can move faster than the military damage. This is where Iran's strategy becomes dangerous. Iran cannot defeat the United States in a conventional war. It cannot match American aircraft carriers, stealth bombers, satellites, or defense spending. But it does not need to fight that kind of war. Iran's strength is asymmetric warfare. It can use drones, missiles, mines, small boats, proxy forces, cyber operations, and geography to impose costs on a much stronger opponent. A drone that costs tens of thousands of dollars can force the United States or its allies to fire interceptors worth millions. Small attack on an oil facility can shake global markets. A threat near a shipping lane can raise insurance costs and slow commerce. That is the logic Iran understands well. The weaker side does not need to win every battle. It only needs to make the stronger side pay more and more to maintain the system. This creates a serious problem for Washington. The American military presence in the Gulf was designed to deter threats and reassure allies. But in a conflict with Iran, those same bases become targets. Instead of being symbols of stability, they become part of the battlefield. Bahrain is especially important because it hosts the US Fifth Fleet and has a large Shia population ruled by a Sunni monarchy. That makes it both a military target and a potential political pressure point. Qatar is also exposed because of its strategic role and its American military infrastructure. The UAE is vulnerable because so much of its power depends on image, stability, and investor confidence. Saudi Arabia has more depth, but its oil infrastructure and economic transformation plans still depend on long-term security. So the Gulf states are trapped in a difficult position. They do not want a direct war with Iran, but many of them host the American military presence that Iran sees as part of the threat. They want neutrality, but geography and security ties make true neutrality almost impossible. That is the contradiction Iran can exploit. On the other side, Iran also has real vulnerabilities. It is a large country with mountains, strategic depth, missile sites, underground facilities, and a population that has lived under pressure for decades. But Iran also faces internal weaknesses that could become critical in a long war. One of the biggest is water. Iran has struggled with drought, water mismanagement, shrinking lakes, pressure on agriculture, and stress on urban water supplies. If the war moves beyond military targets and begins hitting infrastructure, then dams, reservoirs, power plants, pumping stations, and transportation systems could become part of the conflict. At that point, the goal is no longer just to weaken Iran's military. The goal becomes weakening Iran's ability to function as a state. That kind of war is extremely dangerous because it moves pressure from the battlefield into civilian life. Water, electricity, food distribution, ports, hospitals, and roads are not abstract assets. They are the systems that keep society running. Iran is also ethnically diverse. While Persians dominate the center, the borderlands include Azeris, Kurds, Arabs, Baluch, and other communities with their own histories and grievances. If outside powers try to exploit those divisions, Iran could face internal pressure at the same time it is fighting externally. That may be one of the deeper strategies against Tehran, not simply to defeat Iran in a direct war, but to strain it from multiple directions until the state becomes harder to govern. But there is a major risk in that approach. If Iran believes the real goal is regime collapse or national fragmentation, it has every reason to escalate early and widely. From Tehran's perspective, restraint may look like weakness. And weakness in a moment like this could invite more attacks. That is how wars become harder to control. Each side believes escalation is defensive. The United States may escalate to restore deterrence. Israel may escalate to prevent future Iranian attacks. Iran may escalate because it believes the survival of the regime is at stake. The Gulf states may cooperate with Washington because they fear Iran. Iran may target the Gulf because it sees that cooperation as participation in the war. Every actor can justify its next move, but together those moves create a much larger crisis. Iran's response would also not be limited to Iranian territory. For decades, Tehran has built influence across the region in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and among Shia communities in parts of the Gulf. If Iran chooses to frame this conflict as a wider struggle against American and Israeli power, it can activate pressure across multiple fronts. That could mean militia attacks on US bases, rockets aimed at Israel, threats to shipping routes, unrest near American embassies, drone attacks on energy infrastructure, or cyber operations against financial and logistical systems. This is the kind of war that does not have one clear front line. It spreads through networks, and that is exactly the type of conflict the United States has struggled with in the past. America is very good at destroying fixed targets, bases, radar systems, airfields, command centers, and missile sites. But it is much harder to destroy a decentralized network, especially when that network is spread across multiple countries and tied to local politics. religion and identity. That gives Iran a strategic advantage, not because it is stronger, but because it can widen the battlefield faster than Washington can secure it. The political cost for America could rise quickly. A limited strike is one thing, a long regional war is another. If oil prices rise, if U.S. troops are killed, if bases are hit, if the Gulf becomes unstable, or if another Middle Eastern conflict begins to look open-ended, the pressure inside the United States will grow. That may be part of Iran's calculation. Tehran may not believe it can defeat America militarily, but it may believe it can make the war politically and economically unbearable. Still, that strategy is risky for Iran as well. If American forces suffer major casualties, Washington could escalate dramatically. If Israel is hit hard, Israel may respond with overwhelming force. If Hormuz is threatened, Europe and Asia may be pulled into the crisis because their energy security depends on stability in the Gulf. That is where the conflict begins to move beyond the region. Europe is already under pressure because of the war in Ukraine and its reduced dependence on Russian energy. If the Gulf becomes unstable, Europe faces another energy shock at a time when its economies are already vulnerable. Germany, France, Britain, Italy, and other European powers may not want another Middle Eastern war. They cannot ignore a crisis that threatens global energy flows. Their involvement may not begin with a dramatic declaration. It could start with naval deployments, shipping escorts, intelligence support, air defense coordination, sanctions, or emergency energy planning. That is often how wider wars develop, gradually through limited steps that accumulate. Russia also has a stake. Moscow will not look at Iran in isolation. If Iran is weakened or destabilized, Russia may see that as another Western move against the anti-US bloc. Since Russia is already in direct confrontation with the West over Ukraine, a Middle Eastern crisis could become connected to the broader struggle over the global balance of power. China's position is more complicated. Beijing needs stable energy flows, so it does not want chaos in Hormuz. A major oil shock would hurt China's economy, but China also benefits when the United States becomes overstretched. If Washington is forced to divide attention, weapons, money, and political capital between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, that creates opportunities for Beijing. So China will likely try to look cautious and responsible in public while quietly calculating how the crisis affects long-term American influence. This is why the conflict is bigger than a normal regional war. The United States built a system in which Gulf energy, the US dollar, military protection, and global finance are deeply connected. Gulf states sell oil and gas. Much of the world trades energy in dollars. Gulf wealth flows into Western markets. American military power helps protect the entire structure. If Iran can shake confidence in the Gulf, it is not just attacking a few military bases or oil facilities. It is challenging one of the foundations of American power in the region. That is the deeper meaning of this crisis. Iran's most dangerous strategy may not be to win a conventional war. It may be to expose the fragility of the system America protects. To show that American bases cannot guarantee safety. To show that expensive missile defenses cannot protect every target. To show that Gulf wealth depends on confidence that can disappear quickly. To show that the global economy still relies on fragile choke points. And to force the United States to spend more and more to hold the old order together. But this also creates a humanitarian danger that should not be ignored. If infrastructure becomes a major target, civilians will pay the price first. In Iran, attacks on power, water, transportation, or fuel systems could affect millions of people. In the Gulf, attacks on ports or desalination plants could threaten daily life very quickly. In Israel, missile and drone strikes could create public pressure for even stronger retaliation. Across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Bahrain, sectarian tension could rise. Once modern infrastructure becomes part of the battlefield, the line between military pressure and civilian catastrophe becomes thin. That is why the next phase matters so much. There are several indicators to watch closely. First, does Iran move from symbolic retaliation to sustained attacks on Gulf infrastructure? If airports, oil terminals, gas facilities, ports, or desalination plants become repeated targets, the conflict enters a much more dangerous phase. Second, does the United States expand its campaign deeper into Iran? Limited defensive strikes are one thing. A broader campaign against leadership targets, infrastructure, missile sites, nuclear facilities, or internal command networks would be something very different. Third, do Iran-backed groups across the region activate at scale? If Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and parts of the Gulf heat up at the same time, this is no longer a single-front confrontation. Fourth, does the Strait of Hormuz remain open? The strait does not need to be fully closed to cause panic. Even serious risk in the area could raise shipping costs, disrupt energy markets, and trigger global economic pressure. Fifth, how do Russia, China, and Europe respond? Their decisions will determine whether this remains a regional crisis or becomes part of a much larger global power struggle. And finally, how does the American public react? Every war eventually comes home politically. If oil prices rise, if US troops are killed, if markets fall, or if another long Middle Eastern commitment appears likely, domestic pressure in America could shape Washington's decisions as much as the battlefield does. That is what makes this moment unstable. The military logic pushes toward escalation. The economic logic demands protection of energy flows. The political logic warns against another endless war. Iran's logic demands retaliation. Israel's logic demands deterrence. The Gulf's logic demands survival without becoming the main battlefield. These pressures do not point in the same direction. They collide, and when they collide, the risk of miscalculation rises. One drone hits the wrong target, one missile kills too many people, one ship is struck, one base takes major casualties, one government panics, one leader decides that backing down is more dangerous than escalating. That is how a crisis becomes a war, and that is how a regional war can become something much larger. The most dangerous part is not that every country wants a wider conflict. Most probably do not. The danger is that each side may believe its next escalation is necessary, justified, and defensive. That is how conflicts spiral. Wars are often launched with promises of control. They are described as limited. They are framed as necessary, but once they begin, they create their own momentum, revenge. Fear, domestic pressure, alliance obligations, economic shocks, and political pride. Leaders who believe they are managing events can quickly find themselves reacting to forces they no longer fully control. That may be where this crisis is heading, not necessarily toward an immediate global war, but toward a wider regional conflict with global economic consequences. Right now, the world should watch the Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the cost of escalation. If Hormuz stays open, Gulf infrastructure remains mostly untouched, and Washington avoids a broad campaign inside Iran, there may still be room to contain the crisis. But if the Gulf starts burning, if oil shipments are disrupted, if American bases suffer serious casualties, or if Iran's civilian infrastructure becomes a central target, then this conflict moves into a completely different category. At that point, the question will no longer be who started it. The question will be who still has enough control to stop it. Because in the Middle East, wars rarely stay within the borders drawn for them. They spread through alliances, militias, oil markets, shipping lanes, sectarian networks, financial panic, and great power competition. And sometimes they spread because every leader involved believes they cannot afford to be the first one to blink. That is why this moment matters. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow, but the consequences of a crisis there are global. The Gulf looks wealthy, but much of that wealth depends on security and confidence. The United States remains powerful, but power becomes expensive when every base and every ally becomes a potential target. Iran is under pressure, but pressure can make a regime more dangerous, not less. And the global economy, for all its technology and complexity, still depends on oil, ships, ports, insurance, water, and political stability in one of the most volatile regions on Earth. So the question now is not whether Iran responds, the question is how far the response goes and whether the next round of retaliation can still be contained. If the answer is no, then we may be watching the beginning of a much longer, more expensive, far more dangerous chapter in the Middle East. We will continue to follow every major development closely.